Thank you very much, Gaetano, and thanks for putting up this wonderful conference. What a great start. Thank you to all speakers so far, and to the ones that will be speaking after this excellent session, which is starting now. Indeed, we've seen that artificial intelligence started off as a tool to enhance performance, but today it enhances and impacts on content as well. And as such, it also impacts on various values, attitudes, and practices, all the elements that build up one of the definitions of culture. And this session is going to be about artificial intelligence, culture, and society. And without much ado, I would like to get into the topics. We have 3 different speakers, which will get into 3 different perspectives. First, we have Professor John Festinger, who is neither British nor Columbia, but he comes from British Columbia. And he is going to talk about what artificial intelligence does in terms of changing media and entertainment, and how things become very personalized, and is it good or bad? What do you think, John?
Both.
Right. Okay, there you go.
It's a risk. Right. So first thing is I start my timer. Second thing is I say to Gaetano, that is a fantastic idea. I'll start giving out water bottles for evaluations at the end of my courses. That should work. So that's a great academic trick. Thirdly, in all seriousness, to thank my various students. In past years, I have done entire lectures for one class, my communications law class at UBC. This year, I have run elements of this past all my courses and over a much longer period of time. This is the revised abstract. Ignore it until you look at the papers. This is where things started, and they started with Gaetano. We were speaking over the summer, and he and I simultaneously started talking about what we were thinking about. And these were kind of my notes that I had put on my iPhone notes some weeks before about media of the future being individually tailored in all aspects, because that's the trend that we are clearly seeing, especially in social media. Gaetano saw that, and I saw that. We saw that separately, and of course, in true academic fashion, we decided we would write a paper together. And this is the truth about academia. Oh, look, a cool new research idea. Oh my God, please finish the papers you've already started. But we're here, and more on that later. So where do we begin this exploration of completely individuated AI encouraged, big data encouraged media? And everything I'm going to say, you'll see it's easier to understand in a film context, but absolutely applies in a narrative sense equally to what video games can look like. But this is where I suggest you start thinking about it. Gamer discovers his deceased father's ghost on an old Xbox game, challenges it to a race. Father passes away. Hope you don't relate too much to that. I do. Father was a gamer on the original Xbox, played racing games, which is what I play, and the son found the father's ghost car and the father's time on the Xbox. And so what did the son do? He would race the father, but if he was beating his father's ghost car, what a wonderfully literal name for it, he would stop before the finish line, let his father beat him, because, of course, if he beat his father, the ghost car would disappear. So that's very individual, that's very particular. Also, I am a race sim person. This is a story that I remember very vividly in real time. Grand Prix Legends, it's a game that came out in 1997, had a very avid community that basically rebuilt the game from scratch. And it was an extraordinary game with an extraordinary modding community. And one day somebody wandered onto the forums and said, I've heard about you guys. My father is ill. It was quite clear that what she meant to say was my father was dying, but didn't want to say that. He raced one race in the 1965 Tasman Series in Australia. Would it be possible for somebody to make that car set? And those of us who are part of the community, and I'm sorry if I get choked up, immediately somebody came on and said, let's take this offline. And those of us who are part of the community knew that that car set was going to be built. And recently I kind of looked through and I found a car set. It might be that car set by that modder or not. But the point is that was individuated media, and it's deeply connected and deeply emotional. So that's a place to start. Now let me talk a little bit about where this came from. I didn't realize until I went through the exercise that today's talk is part of a trilogy that I gave here. I thought certainly my first talk and my second talk were different, and originally I thought this was a third and different talk. I knew I wasn't doing sequels. Sequels are bad, as most of you know from watching films. But I didn't discover until I was doing it that this was a trilogy. In 2016, I talked about the right to create for mods. I grounded it in post-structuralism, in the notion that modders contribute so much to the game, and sometimes very many more man-hours than the original developers, that there should be a right to mod. Last year, I dealt with a very narrow point, and that was what happens in a fully emergent or emerged virtual reality world if somebody wants to use your information, your data, against you, and you can't tell what's real and what's not real. And in that context, I dealt with when the law should intervene, particularly if you lose your human agency, and what the remedies were, including the possibility of a court enforcing a constructive trust in those circumstances. This year, I'm talking about completely individuated media. And what I realized is that what I'm really talking about is what I didn't talk about last year, and that was whether copyright plays a role. If it's completely individuated, who's supplying the story? And I'm not just being post-structuralist here. You're supplying the elements of the media that's being reflected back to you. Don't you deserve something for that? That's the premise. It's like a card game. It takes two players, the rules of the game, and the cards to play it. It's not any one element. If you just have the cards, there's no game. If there's only one player, it's solitaire. This gets fairly complex fairly quickly. So the common denominator between my talks is, in the end, that it is we who are co-authors effectively, and perhaps are entitled to rights. If we are co-authors in the narrative that we're either playing or watching, don't we get something for that? So that's a skip to the end. But I will remind you of the magnificent work of Bruce Boyden of Marquette, who wrote a paper called Games and Other Uncopyrightable Systems, where he asked himself why, under law, games, not video games, games are uncopyrightable. And came down to two choices: the idea-expression dichotomy, that a game is an idea and that is unexpressed and therefore uncopyrightable, or that a game is a system. And Boyden concluded, by looking at all the jurisprudence, that the correct answer was that games are a system, and the game itself is actually supplied by the players. Systems are shells into which users pour meaning. So yes, that is very consistent with a post-structural view of the world, where you replace, you decentralize the author and replace the author with the reader. So the reader's view of the world and the author's view of the world, in a post-structuralist sense, are equal. Now, whether you believe that or not, it's not hard to accept that both have value. And that's the essence of where we're going today. So, Entertainment 4.0. In Kim Voll, my colleague from the Center for Digital Media in Vancouver, who's still on the letterhead, in her, on the website rather, in her parlance, most of what I'm going to talk about is narrow AI that already exists. So the starting point here is, what does the technology allow us to do now? And I'm going to put this in a film sense because it's easy. So you might remember that in Star Wars, in the most recent 2 Star Wars films, ultra-realistic digital versions of characters were created and placed into the film because the actors were too old or not around, which led, in fact, to Disney saying, after Carrie Fisher had passed away, that they were not going to bring back a digital Princess Leia for the next film out of respect for Carrie Fisher. Very interesting to note that they didn't say they weren't going to do it because they didn't have the rights. I suspect they actually did have the rights because they'd already done a version of that. So they were not going to do it out of respect. But that tells you how realistic this technology is. And you might remember the fake Obama with the fake Obama voice, and very hard to tell from something that is completely real. And more recently, Epic Games has shown off its technology, which is incredibly impressive. So we keep on making progress in this regard. We have AI that writes screenplays. Watch this film. It's actually not that bad. And think about how far it can go in the future. We have AI that can create soundtracks and insert it into film. We have, can I get some water, please? We have AI that is starting to be able to direct. Thank you very much. But this is the one area, directing, where it might be the general AI is needed. It's somewhere, but it's not probably as far as it needs to be convincing. But I'm pretty sure it's going to get there. But this is the only general AI that seems to be needed. So now let's talk about the other piece. We talked about the technology that allows complete fidelity. So, and you'll see where this goes. Let's talk about what happens when we add that to algorithmically processed big data, specifically about you as an individual. So this notion of algorithms, if you've seen the film War Games, sort of, to me, started here. It was a movie of my youth. And we know that simple algorithms can make mistakes, and that's where we learned it. But this is probably more telling. Some of you may know this. Netflix, when it decided to make House of Cards, took the data, and House of Cards was quite a while ago, took the data supplied by its audience, you, and figured out what its audience liked. And instead of the traditional way of making a film or a TV series, which is you get pitched by a bunch of companies, I used to be in the TV business, a bunch of production companies, and you pick what you think is the best idea, Netflix went out with a 2-pager saying these are the elements based on the data we have on our audience. These are the elements we want in the series. Our subscribers like political dramas. They love Kevin Spacey. We want that in what you're going to do. Give us the treatment. And in fact, it worked. House of Cards worked. Now, maybe people needed to do more deep diving with their AI into Kevin Spacey's other predilections, because he's been fired for reasons you understand. This is a very recent report from Cambridge on the dangers of AI. We've talked about them already this morning, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You can go directly to the report, or you can go to this article, which will give you the short form. All of which raises the question that Chris was talking about this morning. Well, how much law should we have? At what point should we intervene? What are the real dangers? And there are, of course, lots of doomsday scenarios out there, so I need not reinforce that. I've given my own examples here, but play this game with me. What if an algorithm knew your favorite type of movie, your favorite stars, your favorite screenwriter, your favorite plot tropes? What kind of plots do you like? I like time travel that teaches life lessons. That's my thing. Your favorite plot points and dialogue that you laugh at. How's it going to know? Because it hears you laugh. What you cry at. Favorite music. Your personality profile. We've seen how that worked for Cambridge Analytica. So that's entirely possible. Your personal history and biographical details. It's all out there somewhere. It can be found. And pretty well everything else about you. It could make a movie that was really compelling to you and individuated to you. And it should work really well. So at the extreme, it would be like an algorithmically directed The Truman Show. You might be, if it was a game, in the game, or in the movie, you might not even be a character, but it would be so closely aligned to what works for you that it could create almost any emotional reaction that it was going for. But if you go back to this slide, you see that we would, in that world, simultaneously be the audience and effectively a co-creator of the work. And this is where we're going now in social media. This is the feedback we now get from Netflix. Hey, watch this movie. Based on what we know about you, you'll like it. Well, who's supplying that data? You are. One day, you might choose the ending to a Netflix show. That's an appetizer. This is by far the most interesting thing I've seen in a long time along these lines, and this is very recent. This is the new project of Will Wright, which he's looking for artists because how you play the game, and Will Wright's games are always interesting from the perspective of you asking yourself whether they're a game or not, is you supply your memories and the game will create your memories. So that is completely, that's the first step along this completely individuated content made directly for you. Because your version of Will Wright's game and my version of Will Wright's game are going to look very different. Maybe the art style will be the same, but that's about it. So that takes us to Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. Because what seems to have happened in the US election is that particular people were targeted, forming groups. Not that groups were targeted who happened to be individuals, but that individual characteristics were grouped and targeted with fake news meant for them. That's pretty darn individuated. So if you're looking for dystopic examples, this is the best one we've seen. And we've seen the impact of it. And Mark Zuckerberg isn't looking that good these days. In Canada, and I'm sure many other jurisdictions in the world, are opening inquiries into Facebook for exactly this reason. I just had to show this. Doesn't this feel like a long time ago? This was 2013, Bono on the cover of MIT Technology Review, Big Data Will Save Politics. Not so far. From an academic perspective, this is written by a ton of people, but the academic reaction, most particularly Jonathan Zittrain of Harvard Law School and others, the basic reaction is we need to research this and we need funding for research, which is a fairly standard academic reaction. But we will, and it outlines some of the problems, including free expression, and interestingly doesn't talk a lot about copyright. Sorry about the darkness here, but I want to talk about a deeper problem, an undercurrent to all of this. And let me check my time while I'm doing it, because I think there's something critical that we need to look at. And that is, this is a film. It's a standard short film about the dystopic universe where corporations run the world and there's no government to be found. That's a fairly standard fantasy. We have it in Half-Life. It's the trope of corporations replacing government. But what it really is a cover for is an actual real-life problem. And that real-life problem is that constitutional rights, or fundamental rights, as Chris referred to them earlier, are generally available in our relationship as citizens with government, not in our relationship with companies. Companies are people. So those are people-to-people relationships, and those, as we know, get moderated through end-user license agreement through contract. So you may know the meme, but I think at this stage, we are all looking rather longingly at constitutional rights and protections, and media companies are looking at us and wondering why we care so much. And that's because we're not getting our fundamental rights. So, legal considerations. I'm going to go through these very quickly because we've covered most of them already. Big question, to regulate or not regulate. This is our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, warning Facebook months ago that if they don't get their act together, we're going to regulate them, which is really interesting. I wonder what the RCMP told him and what they learned from other intelligence organizations that knew then what we all know now about Facebook. There are some issues, political issues and legal issues that could slow down this process. Section 230 of the DMCA, First Amendment free speech rights everywhere in the world. Another answer is privacy. This is a great article from Chris Pounder, which I recommend highly, which takes the Facebook Cambridge Analytica model and puts it through a data protection analysis in the coming European regime and says Facebook fails completely. So that's a bit comforting that the EU rules would work. Last year I talked about information, this is Jack Balkin and Jonathan Zittrain, Jack from Yale, Zittrain from Harvard, with a notion of information fiduciaries, which Balkin immediately jumped on Zuckerberg and said, Zuckerberg admitted that Facebook is an information fiduciary by taking responsibility, which will be very useful in the lawsuits against Facebook that are coming up. Last year I talked about constructive trusts as a possibility. There's also a mandatory right to be forgotten that you could impose on this kind of data, that companies have to just forget about it once they've used it, or even not having used it. Our personality rights. If you have so much data about me and you're making films and, that involve me, my personality rights are effectively, or could effectively be a property right. But the core copyright problem in AI is this one. This is Google Clips. It's a smart camera with embedded AI. It's not going across the internet. It's not that expensive. And these are Australian lawyers, but they've written a short note saying, well, there's no intellectual property that belongs to anybody because it's the AI who created the copyright. So that illustrates the problem. It's not really the same problem as the monkey selfie problem, I don't think, because we just seem to not be according animals the rights to copyright. There's an attempt to that. But here's why it's different. Google Clips is taking pictures in my home of my animals. I'm at the very least a set designer. I'm at the very least someone who has supplied all of the information. So that takes us to the final place here. And that is, who are we? What are we supplying? If you know Derek Parfit's work from Cambridge, you know, he notes that our identity is not necessarily the identity of a digital duplicate of us. My daughter, my 16-year-old, makes essentially the same point when I asked her about this talk. The person we show ourselves to be on social media is often our best or our most superficial. Therefore, the algorithmic thing won't work because it won't really show us what we want to see. And that may be true the first time. It's probably not true the 100th time. So all of this proves how complex, I suggest, how complex we really are. And we're so complex that effectively we must be co-creators. So if we're co-creators, shouldn't we have rights? And there is a precedent for this. If you want to look at the Statute of Anne, you can look at it as the beginning of economic rights for authors, but you can also look at it as the end of a trajectory that actually got the rights to their work back to the authors. So the metaphor and the analogy is we're supplying all this data. We could amend copyright law so that we are effectively co-authors, and that gives us control of our own data. And I never before, until working on this, saw copyright as part of the larger solution to this deeper problem. So this is what Gaetano and I are working on, and we will explore this in greater detail, and we hope you'll read it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. That was very interesting. I was wondering if I can just ask you to spend 1 more minute or 30 seconds. If you could say a few more words about how do you see the expansion of this scope of co-authorship? It is an existing concept in copyright, but you're suggesting that you give it a new meaning, right?
Well, I'm suggesting new meaning, particularly because, and different jurisdictions have different decisions, but co-authorship has been a fairly narrowly used method in copyright law. In Canada, for example, the courts have decided that for co-authorship to exist, both co-authors have to intend for it to exist. So there's a very famous case involving Sarah McLachlan, who you may have heard of, and somebody who helped co-write her songs, no doubt, in the studio. He intended co-authorship, she didn't, she won. So we have to, I think, increase the scope of co-authorship because we're still coming in copyright from the 1709 world of thinking of copyright in a very linear way when we are in a very digital place.
Thank you very much. We will continue, if we have time, with more questions after the 2 speakers. Now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Vladislav Arhipov from the State University of St. Petersburg. He is going to talk about some of the issues related to regulation, how to shape the legal framework for the future, and very interestingly, he's going to talk about some very specific experiences in Russia in terms of looking at regulation. So, Vladislav.
We resolving this technical problem, I just wanted to say that initially I wanted to use a very different start for this presentation. But when I arrived to London and when I arrived to Ironmonger's Hall, I can no longer hide my feelings. 6 months ago, when I first was in London, I fell in love with the city, actually. And here in Ironmonger's Hall, I can see all what people like me loves in United Kingdom. Deep history and unique aesthetics. That's just purely fascinating. So I would like to thank Gaetano profusely for this wonderful opportunity to speak in this hall and in front of probably one of the best audiences in the world. Now, so probably this blue screen is a symbol of the future. It's blue, so it is promising, but it's not really bright. But we have a switch with which we can turn something bright on. And now I need to think about the next thing to say to fill in this gap. Well, Kirsty actually wrote that everything is fine. So it should be somewhere here.
Kirsty's coming. So.
Uh-huh. Okay. Using this opportunity, you may ask me 3 things about Russia you always wanted to know. But please don't touch politics. I'm very incompetent in politics. Okay. Yeah, I can say, but I had a special slide for that. So, but in any case, yes, okay, by way of introduction. So my name is Vlad, Arkhipov Vlad for short, and I'm often confused because my full name is Vladislav, and Vlad is normally used in United Kingdom for Vladimir, which is quite a very popular name in Russia. I teach things related to law in digital world at St. Petersburg State University. I have 2 authored courses, and recently, wonderful, thank you so much. Yeah, but I won't stop now. So recently we succeeded in launching our own Coursera course, which currently has 22 5-star reviews. So it's about internet regulation in Russia, and it is in Russian, so anyone who speaks or understands is welcome, because it gives a kind of comprehensive understanding of how Russian law, which now comprises of dozens of statutes and regulations about internet and digital things, works. Then I also do some research in this area, and I'm attorney at Denton's law firm in St. Petersburg, and I can actually brag about creating a dedicated video game industry practice at the level of Russian Dentons. Ultimately, there is one thing which I cannot omit, is that I'm an active gamer myself, and I was brought up on games like XCOM, Fallout, Baldur's Gate, and things like that. Sweet nostalgic times. I play from time to time. Now I play mostly League of Legends. Yes, so my thanks to Riot Games for this great esports discipline. And Hearthstone. My thanks to Activision Blizzard, actually. Well, I can proudly say that I'm Silver 5 in League of Legends, which is, well, it's actually low rating, but I think Silver is quite good for anyone who teaches and cannot spend, and does legal job and cannot spend a lot of time. At least it's not bronze. It's not LOL. I climbed out of it, finally, a few weeks ago. And actually, this was the point, because if I was bronze, I couldn't put it on the screen. It's quite a bad thing for reputation. So this gives a quite unique perspective, and if we speak about personal perspective, I was always fascinated by the fact that pixels on the screen may create a kind of image of virtual world. My father was an engineer, and in Soviet times, he showed me how a computer worked when I was 4, I think. Since then, it was my love for life, and then, when I studied at university, I was fascinated by the fact that it is possible to make money out of virtual property. And then it all started. So now I'm here, and I would like to tell you a few words about how at least we, my colleagues and myself, see the problems of digital economy from purely legal perspective. So we have a lot of trends. I would like to put emphasis on 6 of them here, and each of them has some kind of unique problems. So the first one is big data. Big data is driver of digital economy. Everyone knows it actually, and big data, as we learned, is also a driver of machine learning, of other legal issues like databases. What I would like to emphasize is that big data is actually something which is not compatible with current approaches to personal data protection. So this is a huge challenge, apparently. And even GDPR doesn't, in my opinion, cure this. So there would be a lot of different problems, not to mention some national jurisdictions where this apparently would be a problem, because big data does not actually correspond to the old-fashioned, maybe, ideals of specific, predefined consent, with specific predefined purposes. Everyone uses big data as he, she, or it wants, and it's quite hard to provide anything predefined and specific. In this respect, we rather suggest to use probably general opt-in. So if you are not willing to go and live in some forest as a hermit, it's one option. You may agree to the general fact that if you participate in informational exchange and modern Internet of Things, etc., which is a separate topic, you give a kind of general consent and understanding that your data may be used. But this is not something which modern personal data legislation provides for, and it's quite different. Internet of Things is a thing of itself, actually, and it also it's really not an easy task to connect problems of Internet of Things with purely legal problems. We can take here two approaches. The first one is, well, here and now. Here and now, Internet of Things, in most cases, probably is connected to the fact that information gathered through sensors, which combine together the reality of Internet of Things, forms big data. And in this respect, it's very important to provide a proper legal framework to trade this data. This probably is not a real problem in the United States, but in many continental jurisdictions, it's quite hard to find a proper legal framework to trade data. But in very strategic sense, Internet of Things is something which may really differently shape the landscape of the future. So if we imagine that we here are not located in this very old and not probably that digital building, but in an environment where everything consists of sensors, consists of programmable code, and things like that, this would be a completely different thing. So there is an idea that code may be used as a new way of regulating. It's not a new idea, it's an idea actually promoted by Lawrence Lessig, like I think more than 25 years ago at least. And in this case, Internet of Things would be a new challenge to the law in general, not just for particular statutes. AI and robotics. It's extremely interesting topic, and we have heard a lot about it, a lot of decent content, a lot of discussions about that already. What I can draw attention to is that automated data processing may lead to automated decisions. And there was a brilliant example of actually by Chris Reed a while ago, who you would choose to kill you, robot or a real driver? And that's really important issue because it's a kind of a metaphor taken to extreme, but a normal situation. Would you prefer that you would be judged for offense of traffic rules, for some minor offense, by some kind of automatic AI or by a judge? By a real judge, maybe not, well, that nice person, but still living person. And this is very good also source for inspiration for further academic works. Now, my favorite, games and esports. There is a whole area of problems which have been always discussed in more than just a game conference, but what I would like to draw and what I would like to emphasize is that we can conceptualize problems related to games and esports into an approach which would be based on a concept that there are limits between real world and virtual world. It's not a magic circle test, which is highly criticized now, but this problem persists actually, and it's not a problem of games themselves. It's a problem of any creative industry, whether you can actually make an intrusion by law into the world of imagination, because this is also a problem relevant for films, for movies. This year in Russia we had an extremely deep discussion over the film Matilda, about a ballerina who was a lover of last Russian Tsar, but Russian Tsar was canonized by Russian Orthodox Church as passion bearer, so as a person who died in a Christ-like manner, and some part of Russian society thought thought that it is an offense to portray a sinful, from this standpoint, episode of his life. So there were discussions about freedom of religion and freedom of creative activity. A legal question is whether we, and to what extent, we may introduce facts about historical figure, fictional facts. But the other approach is whether, or at all, whether we can use historical figure in a fictional work. Then virtual reality, probably new facets of intellectual property, content, violations of law. It's quite vague right now. I cannot actually provide very specific problems related to virtual reality. But speaking about augmented reality, I'm really thrilled by one particular problem. So everyone knows about Ingress, about Pokemon Go, and things like that. Imagine, and things like that happened, that, for example, you are a lawyer of a law firm, you are a partner of a law firm, and competing law firm arranged Pokemons on your territory. So it's like a kind of unfair competition case. So people look for Pokemons of one law firm on the territory of the other law firm. Or maybe it's unfair competition from your side because you attract clients from the other law firm to yours, basically. But from legal perspective, from at least some legal systems, there would be a good question whether you actually infringed certain rights because you didn't put anything on physical territory of your competitor. You basically assigned certain piece of information to a virtual image of that territory in some shared virtual environment, to which extent you actually infringed some rights. Do your property rights, for example, to real estate, include rights for informational and digital image of this real estate property? And this is probably something where we will go into further discussions in future. Speaking about Internet of Things and the future of law and robots in general, I would also highlight one specific paradox, but before that, just a general summary. So current general environment, based on the previous discussions, changes. What changes is general social paradigm. We no longer live in a world which is offline, which is not digital, etc. It's apparent. And probably what is more important is that methodology, I'm now speaking in very academic terms, but I really like methodology of social constructionism, promoted by Social Construction of Reality by Peter Berger and Luckman. The idea is very simple. We live in social reality, but it is perceived by us as something objective, but nevertheless it's, let's say, objective and subjective at the same time, because we live in a reality which actually we create by communication. So we are at a conference. Conferences are some kind of objective social institution, but it is supported by our actions, and what we do now is not just talk, but we actually support the whole institution of the conferences themselves as they are. And this is very relevant in a current situation where we are at fork before the future, because we actually can shape the future depending on decisions we make. But in current environment, various interests clash. We are here in English halls, and I would like to recall a metaphor of Thomas Hobbes about war of everyone against everyone from Leviathan. Actually, this is what happens in the system of interests in digital economy. We have at least state, business, and individual rights. Actually, there is a lot of betrayal happening all the time, because state says, for example, we want to protect rights of individuals, but individuals say, no, we do not want our rights protected because we want to use this particular service which is based on breach of our rights on personal data which are promoted by the state, etc. So making a brief shortcut here, we have here two major questions: whether social relationships change so much that law should ignore them no longer and adapt? And is it conceivable that the changes of digital economy call for reconsidering of the role of law as a whole? And probably yes is the answer to both questions. One paradox which I wanted to touch is whether code will replace law and robots will replace lawyers. Two phrases are more hype probably than a kind of established discussion or a place for firm conclusions, and there is a lot of criticism. For example, once some person said on Twitter that those who believe that code would replace the law know nothing about neither code nor the law. In theory, it may have value, this phrase, but nevertheless, it's also possible to discuss this. We speak here about a kind of institutional design, about architectural design. So when we can design a service which would exclude certain kinds of behavior, like sharing files, for example, or sharing video files, so infringing copyright, we can avoid terms and conditions on the website. We can just design anything. And if we live in an environment of Internet of Things, we can design our whole environment in such a way that we no longer would need a code, in theory, but I doubt, actually. Robots instead of lawyers. A dream of non-lawyers, actually, maybe. But there are serious doubts that this would ever be possible, because law as we know it requires at least two human factors, which can be summarized as justice and mercy. At least now, robots cannot show it. I once was asked, what if well, I once heard, it's better to say that robots would never feel execute justice or feel mercy. They can just imitate it. But the problem is that we also can and do imitate feelings like that, even if we do not feel them. So it's quite a huge area of discussion. But if we combine this problem, we receive a kind of paradox. In a future, or in a picture of a future where code replaces the law, there would be no need of lawyers in robotic incarnation. And finally, what I would like to mention is that with my colleagues, we work heavily in a nationwide program, Digital Economy. Now Russia tries to fill the gap in this part, and what we actually did within this program initially is drafting so-called robotics draft law, which is currently widely discussed. Probably the hype has already ended, but it really was a good thing to do, because our idea was to not actually to promote adopting legal personality as a law at this particular period of time, but to provoke discussions. And to provoke discussions, we actually suggested to assign legal personality to certain kind of robots. And this worked well. So starting from 2016, when we have drafted and published it, it gained a lot of attention, the whole topic. So the provocation was successful. What we have written there, a robot agent, a kind of robot, is a robot which by decision of its owner and due to its design features is intended to participate in civil commerce. A robot agent has separate property and uses it to be liable for its obligations, may acquire and exercise civil law rights, and bear civil law responsibilities in its own name. In the cases established by law, a robot agent may be a party to civil proceedings. So I can expect that most of the audience, but not this audience, probably would say that this is an absurd approach, because AI is not yet actually that intelligent. But the point of this approach, which may have its limited uses even in reality, not in just academic or expert discussions, is that what we suggested is to reconsider the approaches to legal personality in general, and after dozens of hours hours of discussions and thoughts, we finally concluded that there is no major, no major sacrilege in applying the concept of legal entity to a robot, because the concept of legal entity is also based on fiction, at least in part. So we already have, for hundreds of years, fictional legal persons. Why not to add some of them in order to cover problems in particular related to legal liability? To summarize in brief, we faced at least three major problems. The first one, definition and scope of regulations. Whether we need to use the term robot or AI, and how to actually narrow it properly for legal perspective. The problem is that legal definition should not probably be technically correct. It is important to embrace certain aspects of regulations which should be. So we used a workable definition as a kind of tangible machine able to make own decisions, but apparently we omitted, maybe for the purposes of discussions, non-incarnated, let's say, AI, and there is a whole array of problems related to that. Finally, we ended up with that definition, which actually incarnates an aspect to cover, a liability, because liability is a problem. There is a lot of different persons participating in creating of robot and operating of robot, etc. So if we, the problem which we tried to cope, if we model a situation of liability, actually, those examples with Tesla, etc., maybe it would be too far to say that Tesla car is a separate legal personality, but maybe Google car can in this case, because it uses wider AI. But one of the solutions which actually was used before for human business groups was to implement limited liability companies. Some say that limited liability company is the best invention after the will. So we suggested for discussion purely to introduce limited liability robots, so to say. The case is that specifically for the purposes of this absurd provoking of discussions, we directly mentioned that in such a case, robot would be a legal subject and at the same time a property. And this leads to a very unfavorable ethical conclusion that what we suggested is actually a new age of slavery, but for robots. Maybe it's a wise approach, because maybe it's important to make robots slaves before they would make slaves us. Maybe it's not wise, because robots may avenge, and maybe they finally will find the record of this presentation and take me first. Actually, some people during the discussions accused me and my colleague Victor that we work for robots. But I said, guys, we do not work for robots. Robots would first attack us for the idea that we suggest to make statutory rules to enslave the robots, actually. So that's the point here. And serious argument against that is that this may work as a new legal layer of corporate veil, let's say, to avoid real responsibility. That is a serious problem which needs to be discussed here. One thing which I also want to say in this respect, and legal personality to robot, we can make this fictitious personality at the moment, when AI is not that developed. But we will face terrible ethical problems if we adopt that, and maybe we will adopt that, because this is not our invention. It's a thought which is discussed everywhere in the world. But if we adopt it now, when artificial intelligence would be truly sentient in maybe 10 years, then we will face a difficulty. It's like we have never believed that a child will grow up, for example, and treated him or her as someone of limited capability. And to summarize, apparently there is a problem of connection to other branches of legislation, norms. It can be discussed and definitely from a legal perspective. Actually, one particular example. Ethical problems definitely would be very important. As Dr. Kimball told previously, maybe it's already a case where it's unethical not to use AI. And I really like this idea. And also, AI and its legal implications, its factual implications affect heavily how we communicate between each other. Riot Games actually provided a brilliant example of that last year during the week of April Fool's Days. It was perfect. I played during that time. I really enjoyed that, and I believed for the few first matches that it was true. So there was a huge announcement. Guys, we are introducing new elite bots. With you, they are very competent, they're very hard, and you will fight against them. So when you popped normal game, or I don't remember, maybe a ranked game as well, I didn't play ranked that time, you would not see names of other players on the other side. You would see just bot like this, bot like this, bot like this. Myself, for the first 1 or 2 match, and other guys, we actually believed that these are bots. Changes were drastic. You know, League of Legends teams can be, no offense, extremely toxic. And the first one to attack is not your opponent when you are toxic in League of Legends, but your team. And it undermines all team efforts. This never happened when people believe that they are fighting bots. Because it's just bots. There is no reason to quarrel about. It's not real players on the other side. It's really interesting fact to investigate from sociological point of view, actually, and to have new insights about our future as well. So I'm finishing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vlad. Just one question. What is the status of the bill? Where is the bill now?
So the status of the bill is...
In 2 words, please.
It's not yet submitted.
Okay, thanks.
Only discussed.
I'm relieved. Okay. Well, we move to the third presenter in this interesting panel, which is Mariana Drake, who is going to talk about some of the issues related to the policy implications from the challenges and opportunities for industry created by AI. So let's look into some of the governance issues and some of the approaches that have been adopted in this country and probably in some other regions. Mariana, oh, you have your presentation. Yeah. Congratulations.
It's working. Thanks, Dimitar. And it's great to be here today, which also marks the beginning of the London Games Festival, which, as it's a UK initiative, I feel I'd be remiss if I didn't give it a little plug. For those of you that are based in London or visiting, over the next 10 days, there'll be a series of game-related events across the city, including a very relevant AI summit on Tuesday, where you can hear from leading games designers and AI researchers who'll be talking about the latest developments in the industry, as well as a games character cosplay parade and an interactive art exhibit at Somerset House. So there's lots of great stuff, and I hope you get a chance to check out some of it. So first, a few words on UKI. For those of you that don't know us, we're the trade association for the UK games and interactive entertainment industry. We have over 300 members from large multinational games publishers and platforms, as well as small independent developers and businesses working across VR, esports, and of course AI. Our mission statement is quite simply to make the UK the best place to make, sell, and play games in the world, and we set about to achieve this in a number of ways, including working with government to get support for our sector in the form of the video games tax relief and partnering with the Mayor of London on the London Games Festival, and of course working to ensure that there's a stable political and regulatory environment for games businesses to operate in. And that's the focus of my work. And naturally, as questions around AI and its development and governance have grown in importance amongst policymakers in recent years, it's also become a priority for us as a sector, both in terms of monitoring policy developments in this area, as well as identifying any potential legislation on the horizon, and also determining where we want our voice to be in the debates happening. So what exactly are these policy developments? Well, we've heard a few of them already today, so I don't want to repeat any of those, but I think it's interesting to look at three contrasting approaches which the US, the EU, and the UK governments are taking on this issue at the minute. So firstly, looking at the US, in October 2016, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy released a report entitled Preparing for the Future of Artificial Intelligence. This was one of the last things to come out of the Obama administration, and it set out a very comprehensive and positive vision of the role of AI in driving innovation. It focused on how it could enhance human capabilities and help us solve some of the world's biggest global challenges, so it clearly had quite a positive Silicon Valley spin on it. It did, however, look at some of the economic and social concerns, primarily focusing on the impact of automation on jobs, which is something we've heard about a few times today. On that matter, it recommended that as low-wage and middle-income workers are most likely to be at risk, government should develop policy to ensure that economic inequality isn't enhanced by focusing on funding training programs to ensure AI workers have the skills needed to thrive. It's of course now unclear whether any of the proposals in this report will be brought forward by the Trump administration, as thus far AI policy or technology or innovation policy more broadly haven't been a top priority. So arguably, because a lot of private sector development in AI is happening in the States anyway, there's less of a case for government intervention, but it's unlikely that we'll see much appetite from the US government to take a leading role in discussions around the governance of AI in the sense of the ethics or safety of the technology. Overall, it also suggested quite a light touch approach to regulation, recommending that AI should fit into existing legislation where possible, which is quite different to the approach we've seen the EU take. Perhaps unsurprisingly, they've been quite active in this area as well. So far, initiatives have been primarily led by the European Parliament. We've heard mention of the Committee on Legal Affairs report on civil law rules and robotics already today. It had a much bigger focus on robotics rather than AI, suggesting that specific rules might be required in the areas of autonomous vehicles, drones, and medical care robots. Similarly to the US, it also focused on the impact on jobs. Slightly more radically, it proposed a solution to increased inequality in the form of a new tax regime. It also calls for the creation of a European agency for robotics and AI, which would consist of regulators and external experts in ethics who can monitor AI and robotic trends. So overall, it foresees a much more active role for regulation and policymakers. It also emphasizes the importance of ensuring that EU values aren't sacrificed in the development of this technology in places like the States and China, which have quite a different value system. So the EU's seen it as an opportunity to get ahead of that in terms of ensuring that principles like privacy are maintained in the development of the technology. So in response to this, we've seen the European Commission is about to set out its own comprehensive approach to AI and robotics. It's likely to be released actually this month, and to focus on growing the AI sector in the EU by investing around 800 million euros into it through the Horizon 2020 programme, as well as looking at some of the ethical, societal and legal issues, whether the Product Liability Directive, as well as our existing IP framework, needs to be updated in light of AI. So the UK will, of course, now not be forging ahead with those developments with the EU, but instead is coming up with its own strategy, and in comparison to the EU and US is arguably a bit further ahead in terms of having launched a number of initiatives in this area. it's been a very live focus of the government, and over the last 2 years we've seen over 6 independent reports and reviews commissioned into this sector from Parliament as well as government. And this is arguably in light of Brexit. The government's facing mounting pressure to ensure that we maintain our position on the global stage, and they're looking to harness our historic roots in AI development to supercharge it as a sector that we can stay world leaders in. So to that end, a lot of their focus has been on growing the industry. We've seen some big funding announcements in the last 2 budgets about culminating in roughly £75 million to be invested into the sector. But another side of government attention has similarly also been on the ethics. We'll be establishing a new centre for data ethics and innovation, which won't have any regulatory powers, but will be working with regulators to recommend areas where new laws might be required. So it's been a big focus for government, both in terms of public funding as well as establishing new units within our Department for Culture, Media and Sport, focusing specifically on this area. So looking at these 3 different approaches, it becomes clear just how nascent an area AI policy still is. We've been hearing it discussed today. It's still being spoken about in very broad terms and sweeping initiatives. That does mean that there's obviously different avenues available, and we're likely to see some governments going for a more light touch approach like in the States, and the EU and the UK choosing a slightly more heavy-handed approach, and are likely to set up new agencies which might in the future have power over issues like data ethics and AI. It does seem like most governments are very keen to reap some of the economic benefits of having a strong AI sector in their own countries, but are also looking at the impact it would have primarily on jobs, skills, and needing to open up access to new data sets. The potential of regulation is looking to come in a much more sector-specific way, rather than any broad brush ban or regulation of the technology writ large, which can undeniably only be a good thing. But the question still remains, where does the games industry fit into all of this? So in all of the policy reports and recommendations we've been seeing from government, the games industry is hardly mentioned at all, neither is the interactive entertainment industry more broadly. And in part, this is arguably a good thing, because it means that in terms of avoiding any potentially unwanted regulation, we're definitely not one of the main targets. But at the same time, it shows quite an ignorance on the part of policymakers of the big role that the games industry has historically played in developing AI, and also of the creative and innovative uses of AI within our industry, which we've already heard some of today. So a large part of our work in this area so far has been about raising awareness of the relationship which has long existed between games and AI in our industry, both in the way that video games are used as a tool for AI development because they provide the perfect training environment for AI. There's numerous partnerships underway in this area already, like using Grand Theft Auto to train autonomous car systems, but also we also talk about the way that AI is being used as a creative tool within the sector. It's essential to games designers to bring virtual worlds to life, to create engaging and compelling non-player characters, as well as simulating events within games. And it's actually already starting to transform the games development process itself. We've seen from games like No Man's Sky how procedural generation technologies can enable games designers to create totally unique, bespoke worlds for players, which is something which would have traditionally required huge development teams and can now be achieved by small independent developers thanks to AI. And talking about these issues is important to us because it highlights the extent to which we're a sector which stands to benefit from the development of AI, and so we would be harmfully impacted by any broad brush regulation or regulations which go straight to the technology without thinking of its different use cases. which are quite different in the games sector as compared to the medical sector, for instance. We've also found that this is an area where we can play a role in shifting some of the negative public perceptions and narratives around AI. The games industry is a good example of how AI is fundamentally just a tool which can be used to enhance human creativity and actually make much more engaging and compelling products for consumers. So it's a good example, we think, to be shifting some of these negative perceptions. And it also helps to legitimize some of our asks to government around skills and the talent needs of our sector. UKI has long campaigned for more support from government to help address the widening digital skills gap in the UK, and discussions around AI and future-proofing our workforce really highlight the need for both computational and creative thinking skills, which are things that are integral to working and succeeding within the games industry. So we've been using the discussion to push for greater support from government around improving teacher training initiatives and reforming the education curriculum. So these are some of the areas that we've been looking at, but I think it's pretty fair to say that so far this hasn't been a top concern of the sector, because in large part, a lot of the concerns being raised, which we've heard about today around transparency, safety, and fairness, it's unclear the extent to which they're going to prove big issues when AI is applied in the context of entertainment. At the same time, looking ahead, I can see that it could become a bigger issue in light of personalized games, which John touched on very well, and also the data ethics and data issues that brings up. Our industry is facing an increasing war on talent, and it's getting increasingly hard to recruit AI talent, not just because the tech sector is growing this area massively, but we're effectively competing with every other sector using AI. And so that's something which is likely to push up the issue of skills and what more as an industry we can be doing to support training up our own workforce. And finally, I think there's an opportunity in there for the games industry to play more of a role in these debates, because we do have this slightly more optimistic, positive vision of how AI can help us create better. So, and that's it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariana. Just one question at the end. The games industry is clearly going to be very soon the biggest creative sector in most of the countries and certainly worldwide. So what is the government strategy in terms of gamification of the country?
We don't have, I think the UK government hasn't got a game-specific strategy as such. We're sort of supported within the creative industries more broadly. It's something we're constantly lobbying for more support. I'd say in general the support that we receive through the video games tax relief as well. We've seen a creative industry sector deal which has announced more funding for things like skills and fusing technical and creative skills. So we do receive support through other strategies, but we're not, the government doesn't yet. It might one day hopefully have a strategy specific for the games industry.
Thank you very much. With some of the participants, we were together in a conference in the Philippines last year, and we heard about experiences from the Korean government, how it has made this a priority and how have they turned this into a major success for the country. So it might be an area where you want to look into maybe some interesting lessons. Now, Gaetano, you took 2 minutes of my time with your announcement. So I'm going to use that to offer to anybody in the audience to ask a question to any of these three excellent presenters. Is there a burning question? 1, 2, 3, no. Okay. So we have, of course, the comfort break in which you can still ask questions. I'd like to say that this was a very interesting session because it looked into some of the issues of the future, some of the issues that inevitably we will have to deal with. So how do we extend the boundaries of existing concepts? What kind of new concepts do we need to introduce? What is going to be the scope of regulation, if regulation is to be, and how government can support? I think all of these are three extremely important areas, and they could form the object of future conferences. Since during the previous session an announcement was made about an upcoming conference, I also want to use this opportunity to say that we are also convening a conference at the World Intellectual Property Organization on the strategic use of artificial intelligence by intellectual property offices. They are increasingly looking into this as a strategic component of their development, and the conference is taking place on May 23 to 25, just a couple of days before the European conference in Geneva. Let's thank the speakers for their excellent presentations, and it was a great session. Thank you very much.